Good morning. There you go. Good to see you this morning. We're glad that you're here. We're glad to spend time with you in worship of God. And good to see you out this morning, and glad that you're healthy enough to be out, or you haven't been around somebody that makes you have to stay home. You know, isn't that interesting? People make you stay home. It's a whole different concept in life, isn't it? We're glad that you're here. I'll tell you a story of a coach by the name of Chan Gailey. Chan Gailey at the time was at Troy State in Alabama, smaller college. Team was doing quite well. Matter of fact, they hadn't lost a game at that point in time. They were beginning to get a lot of popularity. People wanted to find out more about Troy State. They wanted to find out more about the football team. They wanted to find out more about the coach. They were interested in the coach. And so as the fame began to grow through the season, as they kept winning game after game after game, people kept wanting more of Chan Gailey's time. Finally, one day, going out to the practice field, his secretary hollers at him, Coach, you got someone on the phone that needs to talk to you. He said, I ain't got time. Tell him, take a message or something. I don't have time. I'm going out to the practice field. The secretary looked at him and she said, it's Sports Illustrated. He said, I'll be right there. He started walking, then he started jogging in, and began to think about, they're going to want to know all about Troy State. They're going to know all about me. He said, they're going to put my picture on the front of the Sports Illustrated this week. He said, I wonder what pose I should think of. And so he got to his office, somewhat a little out of breath. He answered the phone. He said, hello, this is Coach Gailey. And they said, yes, sir. Said, this is the subscription office, and your subscription's about to run out. Yeah, life is just that way, isn't it, from time to time? There are times in which we really spend time talking about ourselves. We boast about a lot of things, don't we? We boast about our grandchildren. You know, we pull out pictures. Suzanne and I will become photo-carrying members of that union, that club, pretty soon. But we talk about our children and how wonderful they are and what they can do, even if they can't do it. We still talk about how wonderful they are. We boast and we brag about a lot of other things. We boast and brag about what we own, those things that we possess, those things that we have by, of course, God's grace, been given the fortune of being able to buy. And so we buy those things and we talk about, I've got this computer, or I got this thing, and I got this gadget, and I got this doodad, and I got this. And we glory in those things. We glory in our accomplishments. We glory in this is what we've been able to do. And it may be as much as we've been able to go a whole year to work without missing a day. Or we've been able to go so long to school without missing a day. And on the list goes. These are the things that we glory in. And yet there is one thing, really, that all of us as Christians should glory in. While it's all right to be proud of your job, your children, your grandchildren, your accomplishments, what you have, the thing that we glory in and the thing that we boast in and the thing that we're most proud of is the cross of Jesus Christ. If you have your Bibles with you, turn to Galatians, the 6th chapter, in the 14th verse. There it is, but God forbid, Paul said, that I should boast except in the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world has been crucified in me, and I into the world. Paul says, I should boast in the cross of Jesus Christ. Paul was talking about himself in his ministry. He is winding out, if you will, getting the first or the last few words in of this epistle that he's going to send. And remember, the churches of Galatia, or the southern province of Galatia, there were several churches involved in receiving this letter. But Paul said, of all things, And Paul seemingly always had a section in his books. You can go through and read the books that he authored by inspiration, such as Romans and Galatians and Ephesians and Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon. We, of course, skipped over 1st, 2nd Corinthians. And there's always a section in there where he talks about himself, and he talks about things wherein he glories. But Paul, as he's talking about himself and his ministry, as he winds this book out, says, "But God forbid that I should glory, except in the cross of Jesus Christ my Lord." Well, let's ask ourselves a question. What is it that would cause us to glory? What is it that would cause us to boast about the cross of Jesus Christ? Because when we think about that cross, we often talk and take our minds back to the physical aspects of the cross. The beatings that Jesus Christ suffered, the nails in the hands, the feet, the crown of thorns placed upon His head, the writing that was placed above His head on His cross. The fact that He was literally made to hang there upon that cross, unable to get His breath. Those that were crucified were unable to get their breath, and many of them died by virtue of suffocation, because in order to fill your lungs in, you have to push up with your feet and pull down with your arms to get your body in such a position as to breathe. That's why they wanted to break the legs. They went out to break the legs, if you recall the story of the crucifixion. That's why they went out to break the legs, and they did not break Jesus' legs because He was dead, but yet they went out to break their legs so that they could not push up, so they could not get air, and thus hasten their death. Jesus suffered those things. And we think about the suffering that He incurred, not just, if you will, the physical pain, the loss of blood, but we think about the humiliation that He suffered there hanging on a cross. If He had any garments on, it would have been likened unto underwear, if you will. But He may have been even exposed greater than that. And we think about the humiliation of those that were there at the cross of Jesus, and how that they laughed and Him to scorn, and how that they, if you will, they talked about Him. They cast lots for His garments. "Oh, if you be the Son of God, come on down." We think about all of the terrible things that went on that day. We think about the 7 sayings that He offered up. And we think about all of this basically began at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. His trials began with Pilate and Herod, and Pilate began. And we think about all of those trials. He had 6 literally in all, 3 ecclesiastical, 3 civil. And they began about 6 a.m. But His hanging on the cross began about 9 and ended around 3 that afternoon, that Friday. And we think about those physical things that He went through and those emotional things that He went through. And yea, even to a degree, the spiritual part that He went through, because remember, one of those 7 sayings was, my God, why have You forsaken Me?" And we understand what He went through. But Paul says, I need to glory in that. I need to boast in that. We scratch our heads almost. And we ask, what is there to boast? What is there to glory in? Well, the Bible tells us, and in some ways this verse tells us, and the context tells us, of things that we need to boast in with regards to the cross of Jesus Christ. The first one is, the cross gives us victory over sin. We understand sin. We define sin as missing the mark. Sin is that which we do or that which we don't do, that which we do that we should not do, or that which we don't do that should have been ours to have done. We understand the fact that there's all of us that fit into that category. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 20, the wise man Solomon says that there's not a righteous man upon the earth. We all sin. We all make mistakes. We all misjudge things. We all say things. We all do things that later on we wish we hadn't. And when we think about it, we wish we hadn't. But at the same time, too, we can't take it back. We can't undo it. It's already been done. We need the forgiveness of God. And we understand that there is a tremendous difference between, if you will, occasionally being the one that missteps, makes the mistake, and the one that continues in it. But yet also we understand that we could basically say, you know, I sin all the time. The answer to that is yes. While the Bible tells us that all sin falls short of the glory of God, and the Bible does tell us, as Solomon says, that there's not a righteous man upon the earth that doesn't sin, we have to ask ourselves, is there a remedy for that? Because we know that sin can be dominating and it can be domineering. We know that it can bring disgrace to us and to our Lord. And we know that so many times we can become involved in it to the point in which it just simply takes over our lives and it becomes us and we become it. And the answer to that is the cross. The answer to that is the cross. How can I break that chain? How can I break that hold that sin has upon me? And the answer is the cross. For when we were without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. That's what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 5. That's interesting, isn't it? Because when you look at the text, beginning in verse 6, he says, when I couldn't make it any further, I needed somebody to step in. And he said, Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely, he says, verse 7, scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet peradventure for an unrighteous man. A good man. Some, he says, though, would even dare to die. But God demonstrated His own love toward us. And that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And then He tells us that we're justified in His blood. Being justified, then, He tells us the very next verse, verse 10, we've been reconciled to Him. I needed that. You needed that, to be quite honest. Because the reality is we all need that. And yet that's what the cross of Christ does. It brings us back to God. When sin separated us from God, the cross brings us back to God. Why? Because sin may seem to have its hold on us that cannot be broken. Ever had a habit that you try to break? This is yes, this is no, this is... I'm not telling you. We all probably have at times or another. I've had those that I've tried to break. Some I've been successful at, some I'm still working on. How do we break sin? The cross of Christ. How do we overcome sin? The cross of Christ. Christ died for us. And in dying for us, He became the one. He made, as Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, He who knew no sin became sin, that we might be made righteous. That we might become the righteousness of God. Paul said, we became the righteousness of God. Why? Because of Jesus Christ. We glory in the cross. We should glory in the cross because we've been redeemed. We've been brought back. We've been brought back from sin. We no longer serve sin. We are no longer dominated by sin. We are no longer domineered by sin because of the cross. Christ died for us. It's much like the day of the old one-room schoolhouse. The story is told of a teacher that was very firm with her students. She had planted out in front of the one-room schoolhouse, she'd planted some flowers to kind of beautify the area. And she began to notice that the students began to walk through those flowers and walk on those flowers, and they weren't respecting the flowers and the work that she'd put into them. And so she called her students to attention one day and told them that this was disrespectful, and so they were going to make some rules with regards to the flowers. No one was to walk in the flowers. No one was to touch the flowers. No one was to bother the flowers unless they were being supervised by the teacher. And she asked the students, she tried to show them a little bit about democracy. She said, is this all right? Yes, okay. Well, now if we abide by the rules, that's a great thing. But if we don't abide by the rules, what's going to happen? And so they decided on 10 licks with a ruler in the hand. And the thing was, this teacher could swing that stick. You know, she's sort of like Mama with a switch, but she had a yardstick. One day, a big old boy in the class came back in the room after school, and he brought with him his sister, a little bitty 5-year-old girl. And the little girl had in her hand flowers. Teacher looked at him, and she knew what was going to happen. She did not want to spank that little girl. That was the most loving little child. So the teacher looked at the boy and said, yes, can I help you? And the little boy said, not a little boy, big boy, he said, yes, said, she picked flowers. So the teacher knew she couldn't go back on the rules that she'd established because she was trying to get a handle on all these boys and girls. And so she looked at the little girl and she said, is this true? And the little girl's tears coming down her cheeks. You picked the flowers. Do you know and do you remember what the penalty is for picking the flowers? By this time, it's a steady stream of tears coming down her face. And she knows what's about to happen. And so the teacher gets out the stick, holds the little girl's hand back and begins to draw back. And it's then that the big brother stops and says, wait a minute, teacher. There's nothing in the rules that says that I can't take her punishment for her. And the teacher said, well, that's right. And so the boy stuck out his hand and he said, you give me the licks. And the teacher knew that she hated to do this, but she gave them as firm as she could. And she got to the 5th one, and the sweat began to pop out of this little boy's face as the pain registered. She got to 10. The little boy's hands already beginning to swell. The teacher hurt inside because of what's being done. But the little girl, she runs up to her brother and she hugs her brother and she says, I'll never forget this. Jesus paid the price for us. And because of us, He died on the cross. But because of His death on the cross, I can glory. And I can glory in the victory over sin. But secondly, I can glory in the cross because the cross gives victory over self. What's the middle letter in sin? It's the letter I, right? I. Isn't that the crux of our sin? It's all about me. It's all about it's all about mine. I want this. I want that. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I don't care. I was sitting in, several years ago, a Bible study with a group of men. We were studying. And this one man, we'll not talk about the particulars much, we'll just say this. He just simply said that there was something in his life that was causing him to live in sin possibly. And he didn't know all the background. He wasn't sure. And so one brother encouraged him, find out. Because he said, you may have a problem there. And the man said, I'll die and go to hell before I find out. I don't think the man understood what he was saying, to be honest, or fully grasped what he was saying. But he was so involved with self that he couldn't get out of his own way. We see the picture of that in Luke 15, in the story of the prodigal son. I became the sinner, if you stop and think about it. The youngest son came and asked Father for what? I want my inheritance, and I want it now. And so the father gave it to him. And when he went out, what did he do? He spent it in riotous living, it says. He spent it all upon himself and probably all those that were around him, but he did what he wanted to do. Well, when he came to himself in that pig pen, the text says that he would have eaten the very husk which the pigs did eat. In other words, he was down. For a Jew, he was as low as he possibly could be. He said, I'll go home. I'm not asking to be a son anymore. I'll be a servant. Because I know when I get home, Dad takes care of his servants. And so I will just simply ask to be a servant. But when he gets there, the father runs and greets him. And throws a party for him. Puts a ring on his finger to show that he's a person of position. Puts shoes on his feet to show that he is not a slave, but a free man. And throws this party. And then here comes the older brother and sees the party at a distance and says, as he calls out to a servant, what in the world is going on here? Has my daddy lost his mind? And he says, no, your younger brother has come home. Well, I've been here all this time, he says, and yet you've never done anything for me. He says, the father says, look, you've been here, you could have taken care, you could have taken advantage of every blessing opportunity that was yours. The story, some say real, some say not real. Even if it's not real, it's close enough that it could have been real. I think it really happened. But it's really about two boys that are stuck on themselves and their problems. But it's also about a loving father that's willing to give and willing to share with those of us. It's all about God. It's a picture of God and God's forgiveness of us in the way that we sin. We sin when we become entrapped in self. I, me, my, mine. It's all about me. But the cross helps me overcome self. Why? Because that is the important step that I must take. I must crucify self. Let's think about 2-3 verses that you're very familiar with, I'm sure. But in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Did you hear what Jesus said? If, here's your choice, any man, that's anybody, will come after me. Here's where you're coming. Here's what you're following. Here's what you're doing. What must he do? Jesus said you must deny yourself. What does that mean? Self is no longer first. You know, we often put self first. That's where the problem is, right? I was thinking about this week, and I was thinking about a time in 2014 when Suzanne and I were helping Ethan and his new bride at the time move. They were moving from actually Henderson. They were moving to Jackson. It came to the end of the day. We'd used a U-Haul. It came to the end of the day. He looked at me and he said, "Daddy, we gotta clean out the truck and carry it back." I said, "You're right." He went his way and I looked and I got to thinking, I don't know where the broom is. And he said, "Daddy, I don't know where the broom is." Fantastic. He's never moved since that I didn't know where the broom was. But anyway, he didn't know where the broom. And he said, "And I need so-and-so for the washing machine." Okay. Let's go to Lowe's. It's on the way to where we need to carry the truck. All right. We go in Lowe's. We get what we need for the washing machine, and we get the broom. He looks at me and he says, "You're buying a broom?" I said, "Do you know where yours is?" "Well, no." "But Daddy, I don't want you to buy me a broom." There I caught him. His first problem. "What do you mean buying that broom for you? I'm going to use it to clean out the truck. I'm taking it home." Child never thought of that. I still got it. I still use it. That's what sin does to us, though. We become involved in self, but thanks be to God that the cross gives us the victory over sin and over self. And so we deny ourselves and take up a cross. Galatians 2, verse 20 is that second verse that's familiar. Paul said, "I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me." Paul says, I died to self. When I came to Christ, I died to self. Why? Because it was not me that was important. I'm not the focus. Christ is. And so I understand that it's no longer me that I put first. I mortify. I put to death. Colossians 3, verse 5. There's your third verse. I mortify the things that are in the flesh. I put those things to death. They are no longer part of me. They are no longer mine. They are no longer me. And here's your fourth familiar verse. Luke chapter 14. The thought begins in verse 24. I've counted the cost. And I'm willing to sacrifice that for my Lord. Because that Friday when He died on that cross, He died for me. And He died so that I would no longer be bound by self and selfish ways, selfish means, but I would be bound to Him. And so, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul reminds me that the love of Christ compels me. The old King James Version has the word constrains me. That we thus judge this. What? Basically, to summarize, one man died for us all. And he said, because that one man died for us all, he pushes in, that love pushes in on us and says, look, you've got to understand, this is what was done for you. And so, we die to self. And self no longer has dominion over us. Thanks be to God for His cross. But then thirdly, I glory in the cross of Jesus Christ because it once again gives me victory, but it gives me victory this time over Satan. Who is Satan? What is Satan? Is Satan real? Is Satan actual? Is Satan true? And the answer is yes. Who is Satan? Where did he come from? You ever thought about that? Where did he come from? Well, the Bible gives us some hints. It doesn't really explain it to us. We believe that Satan was being created by God. Evidently, though, this happened before, even creation itself. But Satan, being the created being that he was, according to 1 Timothy 3, what we can pick up, he was evidently overcome by pride. And so he had a battle with God. Well, you know who wins. God wins. And Satan, according to what Peter writes then, is cast into a place that we call hell. A place of everlasting torment, a place of everlasting fire. He who abides in and reigns as such. He's called, among many things, he's called the prince of the power of air, the spirit that now works in the children of disobedience. That one. That Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5 is our adversary that comes about as a roaring lion, walking about, seeking whom he may devour, is constantly pulling at us, is constantly challenging us, because you see, he's made it as his goal, his ambition, as he did from the very first man and the very first woman, to get man to follow him, to become his servants, his slaves, those that do his will and his bidding. You and I don't have the power to overcome him. You and I don't have the power. We don't have the means. We don't have the necessary things that we need to overcome him. But the Hebrew writer reminds us in Hebrews chapter 2, beginning in verse 14, that inasmuch as children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part in the same. Now, who's the he that likewise also took part in the same? Context tells us it's Christ. That through death, the Hebrew writer said, he might destroy him that has power over death, that is, the devil. Yes, the Hebrew writer reminds us that Jesus is greater than Satan. And Jesus died so that Satan does not have hold of us. And if Satan doesn't have hold of us, then we have that victory over not only Satan, but the victory over self and the victory over sin. That we become God's children. And while Jesus himself would say in John chapter 12, beginning in verse 31, and I, if I be lifted up, I'll draw all men to myself. Jesus was lifted up literally and figuratively. Literally, up on the cross, he was lifted up. Figuratively, he was lifted up in that he was glorified on the cross for us. Satan has no hold upon us. Satan has no claim. Oh, he'll make it. He'll push, he'll twist, he'll pervert. But as Christians, we can win. As Christians, victory is ours. As Christians, our hands can be raised. As Christians, we then have the opportunity to have and to be able to inhabit a wonderful place. A place that we call heaven. Oh, we read about heaven. We'll have a sermon here not too far future about heaven. Heaven's that wonderful place. Prepared in such a way as it is compared to a bride adorned for her bridegroom. Have you ever seen an ugly bride? Never have. I've seen some ugly people that made beautiful brides, but never seen an ugly bride. John says in Revelation 21 that it's 4 square. It's a cube. What's a cube? A cube's perfect in its dimensions, equal on all sides. And as John describes it, streets of gold and gates of pearl. We have nothing to compare it to. And there's beautiful sights. There's things that man have made that are most beautiful and most excellent. And Summer is a time that some consider most beautiful. Some consider with all the colors fall and the beauty of fall to be most magnificent. But they do not compare to heaven. But we get there because of the cross of Jesus Christ. 28 historians one time were asked, what is the most significant event in history? Number one was Christopher Columbus and the discovering of what they called America. Number two was Johann Gutenberg and the movable printing press. In other words, it was the invention of being able to print the same thing over and over without handwriting. And so ultimately then you could print newspapers, you could print books. And so they said this was the second because this allowed for communication to people. Tied for third were 11 different events that the historians mentioned. Tied then for fourth were several things. But at the bottom of that list was the cross of Christ. 28 historians missed it completely. The most significant event and the greatest event for all of us, as sad and as terrible as it was physically, but as victorious and as wonderful as it is spiritually, was that Friday when Christ died upon the cross for us. Thanks be to God for that great gift. This morning, if you're not a New Testament child of God that needs to claim that great gift of salvation, that needs to change the direction of your life, confess that you believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, be baptized for the remission of your sins, we want you to do that. Because look what you have because of the cross. Maybe you've done those things and you've walked away from them. And you realize the advantage that they offer you need to reclaim again. We'll pray with you and for you. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, won't you come? All together we stand and sing.